A Chasid in the flesh. The more Baruch paid heed to the discussions that so often took place between Yitzchak Shaul and his two brothers-in-law, the more he recalled the differences in their outlook. On the one hand was the new way of life as followed by Yitzchak Shaul, and on the other, the old well-trodden path which the other two followed. Baruch took particular notice of the way they all behaved in their relations toward their fellows. While Yitzchak Shaul had a ready smile and a friendly word for everyone, be he scholar or plain workman, his two brothers-in-law definitely showed that they had no use at all for any but scholars. In fact, they did not hide their contempt for anyone they considered ignorant and beneath them. Baruch was especially impressed with a certain occasion when a neighbor of the Smiths came in to have a chat with him. This fellow was a gardener named Ezra Yehuda, a very decent fellow, but of course a workman, not a scholar. He was telling his friend the news of the town, and Eliezer Reuven the smith was quite interested. His two elder sons-in-law happened to be present and looked rather displeased at the way Ezra Yehuda seemed to be making himself at home, chatting freely to their father-in-law. Then they heard the gardener relating something about the Rav, and that seemed to set the spark to their smoldering resentment, and they blazed forth into a rage. "Stop talking our heads off," the elder one shouted. "You keep to your cucumbers and parsnips, and don't chatter about things of which you have no understanding." For a moment the poor gardener was struck speechless at this unexpected and undeserved attack. Then turning towards the two young men who were glaring at him, he replied quietly, "If I had had your opportunities in your education, or if I had had a father-in-law, as you have, to support me, I too could have had a decent education, and perhaps I would even have become a greater scholar than either of you. For what in fact do you know? For all your education you have no understanding of essentials. Why, I myself heard the Rav preach that good deeds are more important than learning." And warming up to his subject, he added, "I was only 9 years old when I lost both father and mother. On top of the great tragedy of becoming an orphan, it meant that I had to begin work to earn my living even at that tender age, though I so loved to study. Ever since, I have had to toil without end to make my way, and despite very little free time, I still manage to study Chumash very thoroughly and know all the Tehillim by heart. I wonder how you two would have emerged under such circumstances." The two sons-in-law became absolutely incensed at what they considered sheer impudence on the part of the gardener, daring to speak to them thus. There would have been a real row had not the smith, for the sake of peace, hurried out the house together with his neighbor. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves," burst out Yitzchak Shaul, who had entered and taken in what had taken place. "In the first place, you cannot call Ezra Yehuda an ignorant person when he knows Chumash and Tehillim, and in any case, how can you be so mean as to attack him for no reason at all?" Yitzchak Shaul said a good deal more to them in the same vein, showing that he too could get into a temper when justifiably roused. Baruch saw the wide gap between the paths of the two elder sons-in-law and that of the youngest. His impression was enhanced by an occurrence which took place in the shul at Dabra Mizl on Shabbos Hagadol. The lecturer was Rabbi Shlomo, the husband of the Rav's granddaughter, the old Rav having become paralyzed just before Shabbos Hagadol, having requested that Rabbi Shlomo lecture in his stead. This Rabbi Shlomo was the son of Avram ben Yamin, who earned his living by combing and brushing wool, which made him a rich man. Rabbi Shlomo was a brilliant scholar, but nobody liked him because he was so conceited, always advertising his scholarship, and even comparing himself at every opportunity with the greatest scholars in history. "Yes," he used to say when referring to such sages as Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam, with whose opinions he might differ, "they have their point of view, and I have mine." The ordinary people in the community, hearing him talk thus, were visibly impressed, for they thought, "There goes a great scholar." But many of his more scholarly listeners just fumed at his boastful attitude. No sooner had Rabbi Shlomo stepped onto the bima in front of the Aron Kodesh than his arrogance made itself felt. Whereas the old Rav used to approach his sermon with a sense of humility, first kissing the parechas, murmuring a short prayer under his breath, then speaking with a sense of responsibility and sincerity which was unmistakable, Rabbi Shlomo just drew himself up to his full height, threw a contemptuous glance at the old shamash as he called for his talus, and ordered him to announce to the congregants that he would tolerate no yawnings from ignorant people who did not know enough to appreciate a scholarly sermon. Most of the people present resented the fact that Rabbi Shlomo was going to lecture in place of their old beloved Rav, who had ministered to their spiritual needs for the past 60 years. but no one dared utter a word of protest, for had not the Rav himself stated it to be his wish that the former should lecture for this Shabbos Hagadol? Rabbi Shlomo's sermon was, in truth, a very scholarly one, but as soon as he began to follow his usual custom of blowing his trumpet and speaking about himself as if he were on par with our sages of old, up jumped Chaim Shimon and shouted out that Rabbi Shlomo should not be allowed to continue with his sermon, for he was wanting in respect toward our great Torah scholars. Rabbi Shlomo's face changed color as a great commotion arose in the Beis HaMedrash. He began shouting for the bima that Chaim Shimon should be thrown out of the Beis HaMedrash and put into cherem for his impudence. The leaders of the community, with the Dayan Rabbi Moshe at their head, intervened and restored order and quietness so that Rabbi Shlomo could continue. But there was an uneasy undercurrent in the atmosphere which was felt by all.